Hi everyone, my name is Jose Errasti and I am the current president of the Los Angeles Forum of Architecture and Urban Design. The LA Forum is a non-profit organization that instigates dialogues on design and the built environment through public programming, exhibitions, and publications. Since 1987, we have engaged architects, artists, designers, urban thinkers, and the public in critical discourse about the role of architecture and design in Los Angeles. With a diverse and multicultural board in a diverse and multicultural city, we look inward at LA and its influence, and outward at the influence that comes to LA from other places. I'd like to welcome you to Under the Influence.
Hi everyone, welcome to this first conversation of the Under the Influence series. First, thank you so much to the Ravenhill Studio for hosting us in this spectacular house. Thank you to our speakers, Wonne and David, for believing in this project from the first day, and for becoming part of this new experiment that pretends to create a thoughtful conversation around design and housing in this city. Thank you also to Neutra from the VDL House, who is not here now, but who is hosting our guest speakers at the VDL. And thank you so much to all the members from the LA Forum for Architecture and Urban Design who worked so hard into making this event possible. A special thanks to my ally in conceiving this event, Laure, who couldn't be here today because she's in Italy, but whose energy and creativity was essential into conceiving this project. And of course, thank you everyone for coming on this beautiful Saturday afternoon. Under the Influence is a series of conversations that reflect on the influence of Los Angeles' early modernist era from a critical present-day perspective. We want to together reflect on how we have become immersed in an unprecedented housing crisis, rigid building codes, and standardized design in a city that was once the epicenter of the design community for precisely its experimental and productive ideas. A city where designers and society attempted to explore new ways of living under the premises of affordability, flexibility, and quality of life. The stage of today's lecture is a perfect example of this. It was built in 1938 for a piano teacher and called her house and a studio for just $6,000. Yeah, imagine what you can do now. And it is an ode to flexibility, affordability, beautiful simple details, and to its spectacular context. In the spirit of those times, we want to bring into conversation local and foreign creatives into some of these iconic modernist houses, mixing different disciplines, in this case, landscape architecture and architecture, to enrich the conversations. By choosing these intimate spaces as the stages of our conversations, we aim to turn the distant lecture modality into an intimate talk, to ignite a fluid dialogue between the speakers and the audience. So please, don't be shy to participate and ask questions. It is our hope that together we will reflect on what we did next, share the hits and misses, and in these uncertain times, support each other's ideas, giving voice to a variety of creatives that are still creating better places to live. Today's conversation is the first of a seasonal series of talks. We're thinking of doing 4 per year, so please, if you haven't yet, subscribe to the LA Forum newsletter to learn more about the next conversation, stages, and speakers. And for those of you who are joining us on live Instagram, we will be posting also a record of this lecture on our YouTube channel. So now I'll let Donatella introduce the speakers.
Good evening, thank you, Monica. Welcome to the first talk of the series Under the Influence. My name is Donatella, and I serve on the board of the Los Angeles Forum for Architecture and Urban Design. And tonight is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers, David Godshall and Wonne Ickx. David Godshall is a landscape architect and co-founder of TERREMOTO, a landscape architectural design studio based in San Francisco and in Los Angeles. Founded about a decade ago, TERREMOTO is a collaborative studio that operates on what they define as a mega soft hierarchy, where every team member's creative voice is heard and everyone's hands are too busy to give space to ego. TERREMOTO strives to build site-specific landscapes that are, I quote, not for this civilization, but rather for the next, where the design is underpinned by conceptual narrative and the material define the detail and not vice versa. TERREMOTO does not follow historical models in a dogmatic way, but rather is in constant evolution, defining and redefining their approach to the practice and constantly interrogating the discipline by asking, how do we practice? The answer takes the shapes of beautiful and provocative environments that are fair, just, and generous in their relationship to labor, material, and ecology. Wonne Ickx is an architect and one of 4 partners of PRODUCTORA, a Mexico City-based architectural office with projects in the Americas and worldwide. He studied engineering and architecture at the University of Ghent in Belgium and at the Scala Tecnica Superiore de Architectura in Madrid, and obtained a Master of Urbanism for the Center for Metropolitan Studies in the University of Guadalajara in Mexico. Wonne wears many hats and has a nomadic spirit. He is a celebrated architect, a passionate teacher with appointments in institutions such as the Academy of Architecture in Amsterdam, Universidad Ibero-Americana in Mexico City, UCLA, ITT, Harvard University, GST, Rice University in Houston, Princeton, Joliet, and currently Cambridge University. Wonne is also the co-founder of Liga, Space for Architecture, an art space and cultural platform reflecting on contemporary architecture of Latin America, and serves in the board of directors at the Architectural League of New York. PRODUCTORA is the winner of prestigious architectural competitions and awards, such as the Mies van Gaal American Prize for Emerging Architects and the Oscar Niemeyer Prize for Latin American Architecture, and is also the author, with his partners, of several publications, including the recent book Being the Mountain. Wonne's practice in PRODUCTORA is distinguished by a rigorous approach to the discipline. They work coherently across scales and across typologies. Their work elegantly rooted in geometry and in the integrity of materials, constantly answering the question of how much design is enough. I hope I didn't give out too many spoilers, and I leave the word to our lovely speakers, David and Wonne. Thank you.
We didn't even decide who's going to start.
Yeah.
So I mean, I want to thank everybody for having us here. I feel like super well treated and received, and also I feel really this is like very an intimate space. You know, like we're in somebody's house.
Thank you.
I don't. I thought we would slide this away and see you here. No, but also I'm staying at the VDL House instead of a corporate hotel, and I'm talking. I get to talk to David, so it's really a pleasure. It's also a bit different than just lecturing, so I don't know how it will work. So
This is new to me too.
So David and I, we sat down a few times to prepare this in the last months or weeks. And so we asked each other a set of questions, and we basically reduced them to 4 very simple questions that have to do with the idea of modern. You know, like that's one of the central questions also in this series, under the influence, experiment, climate, and Los Angeles. And so it worked a little bit like this. You know, like David would ask me a question like that, and I would just ask him the question back later. So we'll talk about 4 topics, 4 questions, and we'll kind of pass the microphone. That's not a microphone.
Yeah, and we'll intersperse our answers to these questions with examples of work that maybe half answers the questions as well, in a way. But yeah, but I think Wonne and I, when we the prompt that we were given, and we're so thankful to be here. So that's the subtext on all the levels. But and I feel like we're talking to a group of like so many friends and clients, and so we're thankful to be here. I felt like we wanted to structure the talk in a way so that it wasn't like an abyss or an ocean. And so I was thankful for Wonne, who actually was like, we need prompts.
We need a system.
We need a system. Yeah, much like the house. Yeah, exactly. So I guess the first question, let's do it. Does PRODUCTORA consider itself a modernist architecture office?
And we also challenge each other to try to answer with a limited amount of slides.
Yeah.
But after answering that question, I wouldn't just start to do my normal 2-hour lecture. So, no, David. Well, actually, I kind of looked up the definition of a modernist architect, but so in a sense of modernism as I like a sort of an ambition to break with tradition, no, which is kind of the initial idea and I think we are absolutely the opposite, you know, like in the sense that we have a kind of a deep interest to work with traditional forms and with type and with existing systems and formats. So like a little bit underneath the idea of if it works, don't try to fix it, you know, like. And so I think there's a sort of idea, I think always where we first look at a site, and I see that will come back in your talks as well, you know, like, so what do we have at hand and what is working, what can we use. And so one of the I mean, you also have to understand, I studied architecture and started practicing architecture at the time in the late the early 2000s in Holland, where it was all about innovation and spectacle, you know, the super Dutch architecture, and it was all about like, and then I moved to the US at a certain moment, and it was all about innovation and technology. And so for us it was always, we had a little bit of a pushback against that, you know, like we said, no, there's a lot of things that are working, and so we cannot always innovate, you know, we have to start from somewhere. And another thing was, since we worked from Mexico City, there was always also sort of economy of means, that we have to kind of, okay, what can we work with, what is already existing, what can we work with, and so that really generated that fascination with type. And so if you look today, we just did, some of you were at Jessica's house. When Jessica asked us, that's the original image from the 1920s of the house of Jessica. Jessica is here somewhere.
Here.
There she is. Hi, Jessica. That's the picture from the house from the 1920s. And when she asked us to kind of think about that house and think about possibilities, we immediately found that there was much more charm in that house than the neighbor who just did a big remodel, for example. You know, like, and so we said, okay, what can we do? What can we use of that history, of that little bit of banal and generic history of Los Angeles, tract houses of very cheap bungalows that were built all over the country, and then we used that as a house to kind of superpose that little bungalow with then the blue structure we add to the back. And so that fascination for modernism is certainly, I mean, there's certainly a fascination to work with modernism, otherwise we wouldn't have used that typical, almost like kind of steel structure that of course for us resonated a lot, the idea of like sort of modernist or Californian steel structure, case study houses and stuff like that. But to really put it in dialogue with kind of different languages and different ways of, so actually these two images on the top is like a little bit these two different atmospheres of the house that kind of combine into some kind of a new entity. And so you could see that as well in the house in the Nova house, you know, like close by, where indeed also, and that's again, because there's an economy of means, that couldn't build a fully new house. There's an existing house, and then there's an addition, and we kind of look for sort of friction between different languages, and becomes a sort of much more interesting composition. This is like the front part of that house. It almost looks, and it's kind of very hard to define as a sort of style or as a sort of proposal. So that's my answer. So David, same question for you.
Before I answer that question, I want to actually also go back and
Oh yeah, I forgot
compliment. I told you we were going to interrupt each other and compliment each other, because I think what you and PRODUCTORA are up to in terms of your embracing beautiful, sophisticated design, but like in homes that are like, in one manner of speaking, like somewhat modest, whether at Jessica's house or in this project, is such a beautiful pocket that I think needs even more energy put into it in this moment in time. But anyways, I won't go back much farther. Same question for TERREMOTO. I do not consider our office a modernist architecture office. I am a fan and an admirer of modernism as a pedagogical approach for design. We pledge no allegiance to any particular form-giving system of pedagogical approach, and I think one of the sweetest things about living in this kind of weird cultural moment that we live in is that we kind of post-internet get to swim through this ocean of pedagogies, and our office, depending on the project and the context of the project and what our goals and our ambitions are, love to borrow and kind of drift and use these different let's say historical pedagogies as buoys that we kind of drift between and reference when it's appropriate and actually discard when it's inappropriate. So I guess our office we're big old fans of modernism. I wouldn't call ourselves modernists in any puritanical sense. That being said, I wanted to show a few slides here that almost speak to how we position our landscape architectural work when we find ourselves working near modernist buildings, which happens with some frequency. This is Sea Ranch, probably the most iconic project and most well-known project that we've worked on. And oftentimes, I want to say that there was a weird thing that happened in landscape architecture from the 90s almost to present day, where landscape and or garden design outside of modern buildings also kind of adopted that formal language and became very spare and minimal. And we're less interested in that in a way, in that I think it's much more interesting if the garden pushes right up to the edge of the building, and I think that juxtaposition between the beautiful minimalist crispness of modernism kind of juxtaposed with a wild garden actually creates an interplay that's a little bit more energetic in a way. Sea Ranch, Sea Ranch is a lecture in and of itself because the design controls of Sea Ranch are sufficiently strong that in a way I sometimes feel what we ultimately came up with was we were the drivers to destiny, in that this project was always going to kind of be this way, but it was a fascinating exercise in doing a project that was modest and ecologically appropriate, and in public space in Sea Ranch, the landscape design shouldn't ever actually meaningfully read as designed, which is an interesting prompt to be given as a landscape architect. And it's funny that now that we finished this project, the reviews that we have of it, people are oh, and they're talking about the building and they say, and TERREMOTO did the landscape, and it just kind of always felt like it's been there. And then that's usually the only thing they say, and I'm you paid extra for that. But depending on the project, from project to project, the way we do our moves or intervene with the existing house is kind of a case-by-case study. In this particular project, Garrett Ekbo is a famous mid to late modernist landscape architect who did this house. And so when we got to this house, we discovered that it was his design, but the landscape had completely deteriorated. So for the most part, we completely respected and rebuilt the existing footprint of his original design, but only made modest modifications in that the pergola did not exist before, but the site is sufficiently hot now that they needed shade. But in this instance, we kind of demurred to who had come before. And then, in certain moments, it's a funny thing to try and build a new landscape next to an existing modernist house of some significance, that this one was in Altadena. But in these instances, our office kind of drifts between referencing Japanese gardens, but while also thinking about what's appropriate for the climate and what's appropriate for the site, while also kind of interspersing that with client conversation. This is a Buffin Hensman house. Clearly their trajectory spans decades, and I think this house was much later in their work. But I think that this is a good example of just how you can push a wild garden next to this crisp modernist thing, and the interplay between those two things is actually more interesting to us than kind of the recent landscape architectural history, which was creating really minimalist, spare, boring is kind of a mean way to put it, but kind of landscapes next to houses like that. So yeah, and leaning into region, and I'll kind of get back to that as we kind of work our way through the lecture. Or it's not a lecture.
It's funny when you say
not
boring.
a lecture.
It's funny when you say boring. Was the only time that I appeared with a review in the LA Times was when Christopher Hawthorne wrote this text about architect. Boring is good or something.
Yeah,
or
yeah.
boring is
I remember
okay.
the slow architecture. Is there space for design experimentation in LA? Yes, no, maybe. It's tough. And this is probably a bigger therapy session that we all have together.
There's wine on the.
And we should talk about this because when we first talked to you, Wonne was like, well, why isn't, it's funny to me that architecture in Los Angeles isn't more experimental, and I stopped from going on this long-winded tirade about the fact that I think that the building department actually has too much power and impairs the ability for like evolution and experimentation, but I'll shut up and let
No,
you.
I was asking because, for example, all the young or interesting Belgian officers that we know nowadays, Belgium is a country that's based on the construction of private houses. And so all the architectural discourse is built through that production. And so it combines like young architects with young clients, and there's a little bit of money because you need a bit of money to build a house. And it seems to be the same thing here. You know, in LA, there's a lot of small houses built with young architects. You know, like it seems to be a super fertile climate to kind of create a sort of architectural. And actually, the book, this book Inscriptions that they've posted in Harvard, a kind of overview of young generation of U.S. architects. There's a lot of LA presence one way or another, and I always think it should. I don't know. It should be much more fertile here than, for example, in New York, where everybody's kind of putting nice kitchens in brownstones and stuff like that. You know, like, so there's not a lot of. So I think I know I'm kind of super optimistic. You know, like this is where it should happen, and this is where it happened, like with the case studio houses as well at a certain moment.
Sure. But I think that there's a host of conditions that actually maybe when we open this up, we should talk about that make it tough. And I'm sure there's a lot of people here I know who have dealt with like the rigidity of a building department that I believe like requires over engineering and materials of only a certain type. But we'll kind of unpack that as we get through it. Oh, so it's me. Okay. So back to experimentation and me talking trash on the building department. We're working on a project with an artist. His name is David Godshall. He's a friend, and he basically reached out to our office at a certain point because across the street from his art studio, he came across a vacant lot. He found out who owned this vacant lot. The person who owned this vacant lot said basically, I have no plans to develop this vacant lot in the immediate future. And David said, can I build a garden with my friends who are landscape designers? And he said, sure, for all means. So we are in flow. This is like a long-going iterative project. We're about 1.5 years in on it. And it's interesting in that we don't own the land. Somebody else owns the land who doesn't really have like deep, he doesn't care deeply like what's happening in like this vague interim. And we kind of wanted to work on building a garden and or quasi public space or privately owned public space that I think does a good job of offering what like privately owned derelict land could be used for, like in the vague interim in which it exists, because lots like this proliferate our city like all over the place. So before I'll try to keep this brief because it's kind of long-winded if I like really start unpacking it, but in a way, the way we started it was not through plan drawings, in that I would say that more in landscape architecture than in architecture is that drawings and plan kind of the subtext is that there's like human dominion over land and that humans know exactly what to do with land. Our office is in this interesting moment where we don't want to build gardens that dominate land anymore. So though plans are like super useful and we still work on them and use them to this day, we're increasingly interested in finding alternative modes of representation and in alternative modes of building. and this project was kind of conducive to like this kind of different experimentation, which kind of this drawing gets at. So this is us collecting as a form of placemaking, and performance as an act of path making. And really, in what we did on this project is it's absorbed the detritus of Los Angeles in all these different capacities, in that the boulders that we have are actually remnant chunks from the destruction of the LACMA Museum. David, the artist, got connected with people at LACMA, and people at LACMA, I think they were getting a little bit of bad press because they had just destroyed so much stuff, and so they were being supportive of engaging with artists. And so a lot of the boulder chunks, which I'll show you in a minute, came from the destruction of LACMA. A lot of the ground plane is oyster shells that were taken from a restaurant. It's kind of a closed loop. We're trying to like downcycle or upcycle. This is the LACMA detritus. So we're trying to upcycle a lot of like the construction detritus and just material refuse that comes from our city, and like think about how we could go about making garden space that challenged like what a garden might be or a park might be. I remember my business partner Alan, because we spent a bunch of money, not a bunch, but a little bit of money building this project, was like, what are you doing? And I was like, he's like, it looks like you're building your own park. And I was like, we kind of are. I don't know exactly how to explain what we're up to, but we kind of gave ourselves like the latitude to drift in the process. Now it's growing in, and we hold a lot of art events there, and I guess I say my like tag phrase is that the garden kind of drifts in a DMZ between like ownership and the lack thereof, and it's right now the way like the public accesses it is it has a lock with the combo, and as long as you know somebody at TERREMOTO at David, that you're welcome to come and use the garden and enjoy it.
What's the combo?
Email me. I'll send it to you. And so now it's this kind of interesting, I think, proof of concept of what we can, or what and how we can use derelict space in a way that's like meaningful, both from an ecological point of view, and that we planted mostly natives so that when people aren't there, that this garden is useful to local wildlife and insects, and then that when people are there, that it becomes like this kind of hybrid space that is joyful, and that's David in the early days. So this really has nothing to do with modernism, but I think I wanted to showcase it as like our office working on an experiment. We don't really know what exactly our ambition is or the goal or why, but drifting through the beauty of unknowing and being comfortable like in that like interstitial space is kind of where we're at.
So that's the same question for me.
Yes.
No, because in the end, I mean, when you asked about the experiment, a lot of the part of experiment is just the fact that you don't have really control about the outcome. That's when you call it experimenting, when you just do things or you doodle or you know like. And so it reminded me immediately of this one of the projects we did in the outskirts of Mexico City. It was a program to kind of improve also kind of empty pieces of land that were kind of never prepared in between buildings. They were just a piece of grassland. It's actually quite a big area, and one of these elements we were looking at was the Carol Andres spill pieces. You know, where he just throws like little blocks on the ground. You see it in the image. He just throws them out of a plastic paper bag or something, and so they kind of then end up there. And to be able to think about architecture more in a sense that to kind of allow not a certain degree of control in the process is very interesting. I think you do that always. The moment when you collaborate with other people, that's a factor of non-controlling, or when you collaborate and that kind of opens things up. And I'm always jealous of landscape designers because it's kind of in part of the job always. You know, like you never know how things will grow, or you know, like there's always a lot of.
There's pros and cons to that.
Yeah, no, that's a very time-based part of it, which I really like. And this project as well, for example, there we had to build a concrete house in front of the ocean in the southern part of Mexico. And I say we had to build because it has to be earthquake resistant, hurricane resistant. So that's basically the only way to build there. And And we said, yeah, what color of concrete? Because nowadays you can choose them, you can just add pigments in your concrete. And we said we should do blue. The sky is blue, the ocean is blue. We just make the house blue again. It will look beautiful with the green nature, and it could kind of resonate, kind of this. And then we heard from the provider of these products that color your concrete, that we can do all kind of colors except the blue, because the blue is not stable. The blue we can use it in an interior shower for a room or something, and but with sunlight, and it will fade. It will never work. It's not used for exteriors. But then we asked our client, so we used the blue, and he said, oh, perfectly fine. And he said, yeah, I mean, it's kind of expensive, his house, but he said, we don't know what it's going to look like in I don't know how many years. But he went for it, and it's sort of a house that's kind of, since we built it, started decolorizing. It becomes kind of, parts of it become a bit pinkish, part that is still like in interior upper corners where the sun never hits it, still stays relatively blue, like you see on the top corner. That's probably let's say a facade where the sun never really hits it. And other parts, like on the roof, it becomes already kind of starts to have more like a sunset color. And it was really nice to be able to allow to kind of to put concrete is kind of the symbol in architecture of control. You know, it's always like Tadao Ando, and to have like this big moment of uncontrol. And that reminded me then as well of this project. We was very early when we started working at PRODUCTORA, and I never show it. I think I've never ever shown it. It's a project, a landscape project we did, or an urban design project for Plaza San Sebastian in Mexico City.
You didn't call me.
I didn't even know you existed.
I'm kidding.
I'm
kidding.
I would call you to define it, to specify the 6 trees that are there. No, so what we did, what we worked on, because it's about a time-based aspect, we said like, let's do just lines on the square. It was supposed to be a black square, and like there was going to be a hard granite stone, and a sort of black volcanic stone. And by the erosion over time, by people walking over it, by the rain, you know, the granite will stay for probably 100 years, while the volcanic stone will probably start eroding. And so we imagined that, like, after probably 100 or 200 years, because that's a time frame where that Mexico City works, you know, like these plazas, they're built for that we would have a plaza that would kind of be kind of a ribbed space where like the puddles of water would be kind of just long lines, you know, like in between the hard granite. So that brings us to climate change.
Well, also what was interesting is I asked Wonne, because you went to Jessica's house today, and Jessica, not to put you on the spot, but the paint on your steel structure is peeling a little bit. And I find it, say again? Well, I found it kind of beautiful. And I said to Wonne, like, do you think you should paint? He said, whatever I like that you were like, I could see it both ways. And I thinking about like architecture aging, like in a interesting example of that, I don't know, you're gonna paint that?
Which is a parallel to landscape.
Sure.
Because plants grow and they die and they get woody and like.
What are you gonna paint?
You have to make choices.
You gonna paint it, or are you gonna go with it?
But you have to paint it, otherwise it rusts as well. You know that.
Sorry.
Yeah, I have not much to say, but we I think it's a topic that I think is interesting. The topic of energy efficiency, ecology, sustainability. Because what I like a lot about it, and that's why I showed this in a project that, and I try to tie everything as much as possible to LA. We did this project together with a good friend in LA, Kevin Daly, that I taught with when I was teaching in UCLA, and we signed up for a competition. We won it probably in 2018. Miara knows it better than I do, probably 2018. And we finished it just a week ago, and I'm not going to explain the whole system, but it's one of the most energy efficient buildings ever built in Texas. It operates without any external energy for most of the year. And what I like about the topic a lot is unanimous. I mean, we thought about everything between architects. No, not between architects. I'm not saying like the collaborating architect, but more like between the client and the architect and the content. But like, finally, there's a topic where we can all kind of agree upon. You know, like that we all kind of knew it was sensible that we had to kind of have an energy efficient, smart, intelligent buildings in terms of ecology and sustainability. And so we had endless discussions about every room, about every space, about how much bike parking they must have and how much, but that always came up as a sort of final argument. And I think that's really, in that sense, very powerful. And we should not forget that now it's very mainstream and everybody kind of agrees, but it's still the product of some kind of very crazy thinkers from the 60s and 70s that were, a lot of them actually also from California and from desert dwellers and earthship builders that kind of put all these things on the agenda, and they've just been laying there like fermenting for 50 years before they're now all becoming really a part of a building requirement. So these are offices for the Houston Endowment, an institution that promotes basically cultural, educational, and life in Houston. And another thing in terms of climate change that we're more and more interested in, it has to do with the gardens I saw as well. Like, we more and more are lucky to be able to engage in projects of adaptive reuse, and it's basically the same thing. You kind of look at what you have and then kind of with the materials at hand start to work. So this is we left our office after the earthquake of 2017 in Mexico City because we were on the top floor of a modernist building, but with an architect who hasn't had a good track record of building that stay up after earthquakes. And so basically none of our employees wanted to come to work again. And so we moved, and we had a friend who had an old textile factory, and we moved in there, like first like in one of the existing in the existing base, like you can see here, then slowly I always come back to the aspect of time, which I find really interesting in architecture. Like, then we slowly, over the last probably 5 years, and it's a project that's probably gonna last 30 years, are kind of rebuilding and working on the building while we live in there and stay in there. So we just put a new freight elevator in there, and I think it's like an absolute blessing to just be able to kind of tinker and play around, and like slowly thinking about what can happen, and the budget is low, and so we have to have new people coming in, and so you have to prepare space, and I think that slow pace is kind of wonderful for architecture. And then in my teaching, as Donna mentioned before, like I'm now teaching at the GCEP, and I had a guest this semester coming in, Charlotte Malter-Barth. She's a Swiss thinker, and since I try to connect things a little bit with LA in this talk, she took this drawing of Morphos's 2468 house parts, critical, this drawing where Morphos's or main and rotonde, they exploded the whole house and kind of divided it in all these different parts of the tectonic, the constructive elements, and she then started making annotations of the extractive nature of the labor that goes in, or the exploitative labor that goes in all of these different elements. And I thought it was very smart because it kind of shows how she kind of uses these existing meaningful drawings of history and kind of starts annotating upon them. And then I was also thinking, like, in Mexico we built always in concrete, we built always with a lot of wet materials, and one way or another I think also here in LA there's an opportunity to build well, like all these ideas of building in wood, the idea of building with insulated wood, things that it's very easy to adapt that to kind of more carbon friendly solutions than the way we built in Mexico City, for example. I don't know. I have to question. How can a design office meaningfully wrestle with climate change?
Yeah,
David?
I guess I wrote this, so I have to deal with it. We need better and more buildings and landscapes, but new construction comes with release of carbon. How do we reconcile this? The images that follow are from a project that probably most succinctly deals with like a late, kind of a recent evolution in our office, which is kind of dealing with garden building from a more of a like a whole systems perspective. In that, like, my working definition for a garden at this moment, though that might change, is that a garden is a human curated manifestation of plants, materials, built and maintained with labor on the medium of land. So with that as like kind of the base tone definition, our office is trying to deeply interrogate our relationships that we have with all of like with our internal kit of parts. So our relationship to plants, our relationship to materials, our relationship to labor, and our relationship like to land. This is a project, it's a garden. We were blessed with a client who was really willing to go somewhere weird with us in Mount Washington. And we had kind of inherited existing conditions. I'm gonna jump around. We had inherited existing conditions that were really like less than ideal, but also like romantically positive, in that it was kind of a ruin of a garden that the previous owner of the home had built in an ad hoc way. And if we had like tried to engineer and or like permit a project like this, it would have cost $500,000 and it never would have happened. In that it's a kind of a hillside in Mount Washington that's slightly like sliding down the hill. But our client wasn't interested, nor did they have $500,000, and they wanted us to think about how to create a new thing that existed with respect to the old thing in a way that was like kind and new and old coexisting. And actually, this is kind of a subtext to like a way that we're approaching a lot of like the landscapes and gardens we're building right now, is that trying to do as little demolition as possible. We're doing this thing now where we're running our garden proposals through this carbon calculator, and it's been like wildly revelatory to us as an office in that a lot of the things that we assumed were like good are not necessarily so. But one of the first things that like running our projects through this carbon calculator like kind of revealed to us was that minimizing demolition is actually like the most important thing that you can do to keep your carbon footprint low. So that comes with actually a lot of like interesting conceptual tributaries and like poetics, and increasingly we're of the mindset of like demolishing as little as possible, but in order to build a new thing that is good. In this instance, we had like these walls that were sliding down a hill. Again, back to my earlier point of a plan drawing being insufficient to like to wrestle with like a project of this scale. So we kind of figured out different ways of drawing, and this was an ascent. And really, what we ultimately ended up doing is building a garden that the new garden kind of floats on the skeleton and the ruins of the old. So you see over there, I call that zoo rock. It's this terrible thing we do in Los Angeles. I guess maybe it happens elsewhere, where when there's a failing bedrock hillside, we just spray it with concrete.
Nobody does that.
No, yeah, no, it's terrible. Like you see it like on the hillside. It's sort of sunset. But so that zoo rock was existing, but it was like it's half falling apart. But then there's native plants coming out of it. That upper wall was kind of failing, but not in a way that like was a life safety issue. This lower wall was truly failing in like a life safety way. So we're big believers in taking the dumb industrial building unit, which is this stackable like concrete block, which would be like anathema to like how I like learned how to do landscape architecture in school, but taking that dumb building unit and then using it in a way that's elegant. And so in this particular project, we floated our new garden on top of like the ruins of the old garden, and created a project that in a way is super carbon light and also respectful of the old garden, while also pushing it into a new version of itself. Other than like these stackable blocks that you see here, basically all the materials in this project were from the site itself. we had a special client who was interested in doing that. So he destroyed a lot of like existing walls and then repurposed those pavers into like the new hardscape. So it's kind of, I totally acknowledge it's like a not conventionally beautiful garden, but we're interested in making gardens that aren't conventionally beautiful, in that gardens for the next civilization, which is kind of like what we're calling it now, will be challenging how we build gardens, why we build gardens, the way we build gardens, and like the way these gardens express themselves botanically and like from a beauty point of view is of great interest to us. And again, back to our whole systems thing, in this particular project, this is Wonne Ickx, who's a friend, who's a builder of mine. This is a longer talk, but a small like internal like way of working that our office is doing is trying to be very thoughtful and cognizant of the people who build our projects, in that like not acknowledging their contribution feels like unkind to us. So increasingly we're trying to acknowledge the laborers who build the garden, but while also kind of like having conversations with our clients and our builders about how much money they're making, because it feels very odd to me that in landscape architecture in particular, there's a lot of like talking about, oh, but the garden is sustainable, so that's a good thing. But we kind of believe like, but if the labor that is building the garden is actually being exploitative or is unkind to the laborer, then this isn't actually a sustainable garden. So back to the whole systems thinking, it's a longer trajectory for our office, and we're just kind of like figuring out how to navigate it. And then, what the hell is wrong with LA, Wonne?
Well, it's your turn to answer that question.
Damn! I guess I don't really answer that question with this project. So I'll just kind of like drift around for a second, but this was a privately owned land that is public facing. It's a project we did in Culver City, and in this particular, it was near a mall, and malls like barely exist anymore. But we were commissioned by this developer to build a public space that has now since become like very successful and loved and used. You see the construction over there? Those buildings are all done now, and it's like HBO and Apple and all these companies. And so actually, they were smart in that they were willing to invest $250,000, which is basically what this project cost, on land that they don't own, because the Metropolitan Transit Authority technically owns the land. That's the train that runs above the tracks, but they secured a 10+ year lease, and so in building like this civic green heart of this little neighborhood in Culver City that was kind of underserved with public open space, they now get more people to come to the mall. And I'm actually not against landscapes having like financial utility. I actually think we should be increasingly okay with like parks being able to make a little bit of money, like in their own regard, to fund them, especially in Southern California. Long story short, in this project we used it as a case study of, can we build a project where all the materials from the project come within 100 miles of the building site? So we didn't try to like get too crazy about it, but the wood was from Angel City Lumber, the gravel was from Whitewater Rock, so that's like 90 miles, we got close. The plants all came from within the city environment of Los Angeles, though of course you enter like a kind of a weird gray area with plants, in that I would say about 40%, 50% of the plants were native on this project. So we are planting plants that I guess are technically from Europe and other places, though they're grown in the United States, but that provenance gets a little bit like interesting and gray. And I should also acknowledge that I believe in being like really upfront about failures as well. And since we finished the project, the developer, about half of the gravel area that you see is now artificial turf, which like drives me insane. But like these are things that happen, and there's highs and lows with projects. And when I went and saw it and sent them an email, they were like, of course we didn't ask you, because we knew what you were going to say. So things like that. And it looks very different now because it's kind of grown in. But I guess this doesn't answer about what the problem with LA is, but I guess, and Wonne and I were having a therapy session outside before we had this conversation, but like, our office is of the mindset that privately owned space that's public facing is actually one of the best ways of building public work in Los Angeles, in that the bureaucracy and red tape that you have to go through building a project that is actually public is almost self-defeating and or insurmountable in Los Angeles. So our office is interested in like backing its way and like finding these alternate avenues into public work. And I think this project is like a relatively good example of that, because we were basically saying how neither of us want to have these offices that are large, but so much public work requires that you have an office with an infrastructure that is huge. Having an office with an infrastructure that is huge kind of impairs doing really weird experimental work. So I said, don't hate the player, hate the game, but you said that the game is flawed. But anyways, these are things that we would like to talk to everyone about, because these are conundrums that we face as like design offices.
Yeah, and it is the last part. No, I quickly maybe wanted to mention the book we did on Being the Mountain, and some people think it's a monography, but it's actually basically a set of little texts written for this book and for the teaching we did at IIT at a certain moment when we won the Miss Crown Hall Americas Prize. But also my experience in LA was very crucial to kind of design that book, and I finally thinking of making that book. And I also asked Frank Escher of Escher Gunnawardenna to write an essay on, he wrote about Lautner, a very beautiful text called Tents and Caves, about the relation between architecture and land. And for example, this house by Craig Elwood I think is really interesting, because the book kind of explored, and for example in LA terms you could say that actually LA modernism is kind of designed on flat pieces of land somewhere in the late 40s, you know, like people would just have lawns in the valley, and at a certain moment people were looking for more adventurous lots, and there was not so much more interesting lots of flat land available in LA, and it just went more up the hill. But the architecture didn't change. It didn't adapt itself to topography. So they just started to do these flat floor plans and you see like the Stealth House by Neutra. And it was kind of a fascination about how architecture kind of adopts to topography, and then how in a later moment, all of a sudden like sort of fetishized celebration of topography, you know, rock outcroppings, like for example here in the Frey House or things like that. And so, for example, these are, and then the very close relation between Mexico City and LA in that moment as well. In terms of, for example, Francisco Artigas, who made most of the houses in the Pedregal, and who had a very close relationship with Los Angeles and Los Angeles entrepreneurs, etc. So I think that's an important part. And then a last thing, and I maybe read a little paragraph for you about that. When we lived here, we got to know John Baldessari, and our kids would always go to Rita McBride's birthday party, and then John Baldessari was sitting there with his white big beard, and you know. And so, you know, there's so many kids' films where they always wonder what does Santa Claus do when it's not Christmas, you know, like, so my kids were convinced he was doing contemporary art, you know, like when it's not Christmas, he does contemporary art, you know, he paints. And so a few years later we had a chance to design a Baldessari exhibition at the Jumex Museum in Mexico City, and we're running out of power.
Yeah.
I'll be quick,
Okay.
I think. And so I got to see more of Baldessari's work, and at the time I was kind of working on this book and really thinking about the relation between architecture and the context. And so Baldessari, I see like this very early work from 62, like this duck. I mean, he actually cuts away like the most significant part of the duck, you know, like the head and the beak and the legs. That's what makes you know that it's a duck. And so it kind of, that body kind of still shows you a little bit that's a duck, and he started doing these things with his little circles, you know, like kind of cutting away the most significant part, and always kind of like questioning the relation between the object and its surroundings. In a certain moment, he made actually that work very early in his career as well. It's called God knows, you know, like the expression God knows, you know, like who knows, God knows, you know, like, and then he made it a nose of God. And so at a certain moment, he really became very intrigued in this, in like separating elements from the context. And so you see, he has this whole series called Ears and Noses. And I kind of want to kind of make a statement that like good architecture is like ears and like noses. And I'm going to read a little text that I wrote a while ago. They say that the nose makes the man, but seeing the sensory organs drifting abandoned on Baldassari's solid colored background, they appear rather otherworldly, strange and bizarre. Instead of playing their usual proud and character-defining role within a larger composition, they appear as awkward and peculiar autonomous objects. The shape of the outer ear and the nasal lump on our faces become rather inexplicable curiosities with doubtful aesthetic qualities. Gawky protrusions that have none of the glamorous qualities of, for example, the eyes or the lips. Eyes and the lips can sort of pull it off on their own. Ears and noses are dependent on their context to be understood, to become meaningful, to obtain value. The opposite is also true. A crooked nose or sticking out ears completely change our facial features, let alone an inverse nose, as some of the Baldassari pictures have an inverse nose, you know. Let alone an inverse nose or ear, such as portrayed in Baldassari's altered person collages. If the nose or ears rely on the context to be acceptable, the larger context can also be completely distorted and misconceived. Now, back to architecture. Let's say that good buildings should be like ears and noses. Architecture should not blend in respectfully or anonymously within the surrounding context, but seek to be distinctive, singular elements, even fantastical, incongruous and awkward, like the nose floating over the green surface in Baldassari's lithography, as we discussed before. Architecture can structure and define the context that surrounds it. What was just an undefined green blob suddenly becomes a suggestive profile, just by adding a decisive element at a crucial point of the composition. Even when the architectural expression is far from a continuation of the contexts, or rather when the edifice is not a tacit perpetuation of its surrounding, a building can have the capacity to rewrite and to give meaning to the context that surrounds it. So that's my last LA-related kind of thoughts. Thank you so much, David, for talking.
So we should open it if anybody has any comments or questions, please.
Turn on the lights or keep it
Yeah,
dark?
maybe we
Oh, beautiful
Nice,
lights.
Brendan, nice.
Let's showcase some lights, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Why don't you want to put the slide back to the previous one?
We might run out of battery.
I can
That one.
Yeah, actually, I want to kind of show like how some of these buildings, and especially these little furniture tables, how the ones we made for this Brussels initiative, Maniera, how kind of always kind of these elements that kind of look for the surrounding context to kind of become, to give meaning to a certain corner or to a certain element. It was nice to do this because if you change the format, then you have to rethink, you know, you have to talk, and then you have to, you know, like, and so it kind of puts you into a different mood.
I have a comment about the environmental aspect that you were talking about this sort of agreement with developers, the cities, and I tend to disagree a little bit because I think that things are going in a direction where we are almost working towards this enclosed, super tight boxes, and I think that also looking at passive means of environmental responsibility, I think that work very well. I'm from Mexico, you know, and a lot of houses probably don't have air conditioning. They work like this house. You open the doors and you get ventilation. So there's something about this becoming a rule, right? And when it becomes a rule in a system, sometimes it is thought in a way in which is like a one-size-fits-all when it really isn't. So, I don't know, just any thoughts?
No, it's really, it's true. I mean, I was talking about that specific project, which was kind of a really kind of good synergy between everyone, and there seemed to be kind of a kind of clear idea that was from the competition to the last moment, you know, like from the first competition brief to the last discussions about how much money would we now spend on that building. That was kind of clear that was very important for them. You know, they could do with a maybe a cheaper boardroom table, or like, but kind of the building had, and so it was very interesting how to see how that became a sort of leading guideline through the design. But I completely agree with you, because also that building is a sort of a hyper tight building, you know, like, and it's like it becomes also the reason why people are now promoting it so much is because also there's a lot of money in there now, and there's a lot of materials being sold, and like a lot of things that could be solved with much more low-tech solutions, or just by opening a window instead of putting in the geothermal system that powers a more energy-efficient air conditioning system. I think that's a very important discussion to have, and especially in relation to gardening and LID here in LA. It comes, people are buying tons of plastic and plastic rain tons, you know, like one after the other. It's really scary to see.
I actually take grave issue with low impact development, which is a thing in Los Angeles where if you build a house and it adds impermeable surfaces, like a new building to a house, that then essentially the building department requires you either build a rain garden or you do these rain barrels, and all of that comes from a good place, but it manifests really, really stupidly and poorly at the site, at the scale of like a single family home. And also our rain patterns don't really work in the way, if it was Portland and it rained like a certain amount of the year, then rain gardens make sense. But I have to build these rain gardens, or the city requires we build rain gardens that have concrete bottoms, but then so that in a rain event they fill up, but then that means I can't plant trees in these things, and also because it doesn't rain for 10 months of the year, I still have to bring irrigation to these things. So the whole thing is a disaster. And so it's like this funny thing where like oftentimes these building codes that come from a good place, like globally, like pair really poorly, like at a site design, then it's a longer thing. But like my issue with like LEED and stuff like that is that it lacks spirituality, like in the codification and like in making everything a statistic and math, like in how a building performs math. It's actually, you're missing the bigger questions about like why can't I open the window? I'm like the weird man now who has to call the hotel ahead of time and be like, can I open a window? Because it's so odd to me that these building systems, but you know,
Or why can't you have more glass in that wall? Because I want to see that view, right? But
Yeah.
you can't, because that's I don't know, east or west facing. Right?
yeah. So the system, I think it's a bigger conversation about all these systems pair poorly with evolutionary, revolutionary, thoughtful architecture and things like that. But
we had a Belgian architect in the 70s, was very active in the 70s and 80s, Luc Deleu, and he was against double glass. He said he's cold, you have to put a sweater on, and that was and he was like always in a woolen sweater, you know, like, and so he said like, because you know, and I come back a little to the idea of like it became a business one way or another, you know, the sustainability aspect in building, and he said like, because you know when you go to the supermarket, when the yogurt companies, they glue two yogurts together, no, that's what the glass companies are doing with their double glass, you know, like, they just sell you two window panes instead of one, you know, like,
One of the things that's really impressive about, I think, both of your work is that you, projects come flawed. They come with existing conditions. You're working with an existing house, or you're working next to an existing building. And it seems like you find these kind of very innovative ways to accept that. To accept that, I mean, I know practicing in the city, projects always come fucked up. There's always a lack of money, or there's an easement running through the site, or the client wants to keep part of the house that doesn't make any sense. So how do you situate a form of argument or a form of work around those inherent flaws, which is very different from modernism. We started talking about modernism, and I think they had a lot of ideal conditions. You know, the case study architects, they had blank raw sites. They had a much less involved building department. So
They didn't, but they pretended they did. But keep going.
okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I think like what I find practicing here is that this sense of experimentation in LA I'm finding is more and more of a myth for our generation of design professionals. So how do we situate the work such that it does do something innovative and does do something that has a point of view and an argument and that people respond to when we're up against kind of a world where, you know, people want to have ideal sites and they want to have the perfect house and they want to have the perfect landscape. And how do we kind of elevate the compromised solutions to be sort of almost superior to the ones from perfect conditions?
Just by
Proving it.
accepting they're not superior, just by proving it, you know, because one way or another, and I mean, you never know what you build in the end. You know, you start working on a project, and for example, with Jessica's house, there was a sort of kind of intuition that there was something we could do with that building, and Jessica had doubts about that, you know, like, and of course, I mean, until you finish it, you never know. So I was nervous one way or another as well, you know, like. And so,
You never let up.
and then you just, but I think if you kind of are happy with the result, and it can sometimes be by adjusting your criteria, you know, like saying, oh, it's looked awkward, actually maybe it's cool, you know, why not? Because maybe if it looked less awkward, then maybe I would feel that I've seen it before or something, you know, like then I might not be so excited about it. So I think it's more a question of a sort of not being too predetermined by sort of vision of what you think it should look like in the end. You know, I see it in the gardens a lot, you know,
Yeah.
especially the garden you showed, like, you have to, this garden you showed, it really requires you, okay, is that now, yeah, maybe that's what we need to do, that's good, you know, like we have to, and I think we have to kind of, I look at the work, for example, of this Baumschlager, of Brandelhuber or something, you know, they all work with this kind of, in Berlin, and he made this very cool house, which only like a middle part of the house is actually according to code, and he just defined all the rest as outdoor terraces, but he put the glass in it so he can use it most of the year, but probably in the winter he retreats in that middle part. And it's a very weird thing to do, technically. So also aesthetically it looks very awkward, you know, like, but
I mean,
no, exactly.
Yeah.
And so it becomes, and to kind of accept that as a good result. I mean, yeah, it's sort of a mind game
Yeah.
more than.
I think having an open heart is part of it, and then also being comfortable with not knowing, like not knowing exactly what you're up to, and just finding peace in that, like that I didn't know that this was going to end up there, or Jessica's house was going to end up where it was going to be, is part of that. And also that it takes a particular client. That's like important, because a lot of clients won't accept that.
Yeah, fire your clients.
So and that's part of that. But then I think building a thing that challenges everything that you're describing, but then at the end is good, and then you can point to that thing. I guess it's proving the concept, and it's not necessarily easy. But also, I would say, like, having a strong will, or like knowing what the plan is will serve you poorly, like in that regard. So again, becoming comfortable with the drift.
Yeah, it's strange because we still are a little bit of control freaks, and we have a sort of very high aesthetic ambition. I mean, you're probably much better at that than we are. But yeah, since we sometimes the conditions just drive you to it, especially like this old textile factory in Mexico. I show you the best pictures, but I mean, there's a lot of it's a bit of a mess in parts, you know, like yeah. it's also a moment in time as well, you know, like I think people are much more open to that now, and the story that you're telling now, you know, like that's how, I think people are open for that now, because people are a bit tired as well of, of kind of this sleek, precise design, and where like architects basically showed a lot of, they show a lot of their capacity to do something, you know, like they do like the most impossible handrail, like super well designed with a stainless steel, and I don't know, I think people are not looking for
and I think LA's recent historical predilection of destroying the thing before to build a new thing, which is part of the beauty of the city, is that it's historical amnesia, but I think that will probably start to get challenged radically in the coming years. But which will, I think, Europe, it's been happening in Europe, which is why I like get these magazines or whatever, that it's the old thing and the new thing, and LA's done kind of a poor job of that, but I think that is going to change.
Get these magazines, like as if you were Neutra looking at what they were doing. But for example, it's this whole story about almost like bricolage and work. It's very early Frank Gehry all of a sudden. Also, it ties back to some kind of moment that was also very LA, and that I find it's very funny, because I was looking especially at the work of other Belgian colleagues of mine, of the Velde de Vintailleur they're called. And I look at it, and it's so indebted to these early Frank Gehry works, which were like very much, bricolage, but with a very high, let's say, intellectual project behind it, one way or another. You know, like, and I think one way or another, there's a search for a bit more looseness or something.
Right. I do think there's a lot of good, actually innovative work being done here, but I think it's not just the building department, it's the cost of buying.
Totally.
Because
We actually had a section called Money, 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 and we deleted it because it was too long. But that's
firms that do mid-range work, that if someone buys a house for 1.2, that completely changes the metric of what they'll invest in renovating that house.
totally.
And I think that's actually been the biggest factor.
I agree, and I also like this house. Where's Brendan?
I don't agree,
This,
because this house is a good example. I mean,
but this was 60 years ago.
Yeah, this is
or-
from 60 years ago.
Yeah, 80 years
I'm
ago. But
talking
it was
now.
also an empty lot when she, didn't make much money. But
Right.
labor was a different skill, and materials were a
Yeah.
totally different thing.
but I'm talking about your remodel and your garden.
But I'm saying, I mean, I work with a lot of firms that do a lot of renovation, like Barbara does a ton of house renovations, and you can definitely see that, we'll just do this kitchen and bathroom versus we're gonna renovate the whole house, and that's harder to innovate in,
Totally.
tile color.
Mm.
So it's just a harder metric right now. I
Yeah,
think.
the real estate market presently in Los Angeles impairs so much of that, and so I'm totally agree with that.
Yeah, but there is something to be said about the architecture of the Sun period, in which people maybe didn't expect things to be so sleek and perfect.
Yeah.
So I
Oh,
get what you're
yeah.
saying.
Mhm.
So maybe in that space there is still a little bit of room for innovation, even with the high
Yeah.
costs.
Oh, yeah.
But I think a lot of it has to do with size, because like
The
this
size,
house
I was
is
gonna
small,
talk
right?
about
size.
It's like 1,600, 1,800 square feet, but now with the mortgages, like it's all about price per square foot. So everyone wants to build bigger because they can get more financing and it's worth more money, and it's like it's
I see it
artificial.
most in Venice. Like I just went to Stephen Ehrlich's house, which is like an early 2000s, which is a beautiful house, very referential to Ray Cappy kind of designs of these bridges. And the house across the street was pulled down. It's built to the lot line. It's 3 stories, and his is pretty full on the lot, but not as full. And in that span of 20 years, you can see the difference, and it's kind of depressing.
But also, this house wouldn't meet Title 22. This is now a high fire zone.
Yeah.
You couldn't build this house
No,
out of
there's
plywood.
no way.
So like all
Well,
these things have changed.
It's
that
Frank and
you-
Robbie's work renovating this lot in our house in Silver Lake. I mean,
Yep.
they've had a hard time
Yep.
with the building department, because that house shouldn't exist, basically.
Yep. So there's a conflict between contemporary code and
I know. We were
Let's
going
fight.
to have a discussion. I said, David, I do not want to sit in front of like 10 or like a group of 10 or 20, 30 people that I admire, or friends of friends, and like starting to to kind of complain how bad the building department is. It's going to be such a depressing night, you know. Like, so that's why, for example, I love to look at the Brandel Hoover house. Yeah, it's called the anti-villa. We can, you know, because there's like many of these little examples like that, where one way or another they deal with the same code problems. In Europe, just the same shit, you know, like it's all.
Like the Heaven's house that he did in Palms. That's a house in Venice that I think really pushed the whatever codes or whatever.
What's the name of the house?
It's called Palms. It's on Kevin Bailey's site. Like,
Okay.
It's a 2-part house.
Ah, yeah, okay, exactly.
And yeah, you know,
Exactly.
like one's a
I
renovation,
planned to
one's
visit.
new, but it's pushed. That's the house that I think lately has pushed any sort of boundaries in terms of code.
Okay.
It's
I'll check it out.
interesting, yeah.
But if building becomes so ridiculously expensive, because I don't dare to tell my clients what it's gonna
Right,
cost.
right.
Until it's there. You know, like, and then in LA, you know, like it's like wooden sticks with like foam in there and plastic sheeting.
Yeah.
And I have to tell them it's gonna cost them $1.2 million. and then I think there must be better ways to do it, and it's not only the building department one way or another. Maybe we
Right.
have to live much smaller. I know that
Yeah.
there's banks and there are mortgages and
Well,
stuff.
you
Living
have a
smaller is
client
part of
who's
that.
willing to live smaller.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
you know.
But also, like, if you look at this house and you look at, aside from like the construction of it, which, sure, but the surfaces, like, there's no fancy surface, like, there's that beautiful stone, but it's like, the move is the non-move, it's like, it's all one color paint, there's no trim, there's no fancy wood, there's no, you know, the floors, like, the foundation, and that is part of, that plus, like, the way that obviously it's cited and all that, and a million other things about it, but the simplicity of it, plus the humanity, you know, David, you guys talk about your spirituality, but like, I think that is something about both of you guys' work, is that like, the work is the answer to why people shouldn't have slick, that want slick things, because ultimately it's like humans that live in it, and the bathrooms here are like, you know, sorry, but they're, I mean, you know, they're like, you haven't even changed the faucets out, which is great. It's like, this is a real space for real people, and there's all this aspirational, like, oh, I have to have that faucet or this, or, you know, and.
Brandon's about to convert the floors to marble though.
No, I took out the marble. But yeah, there was marble in here. We went back to the original, but this is marmoleum, which was for Schindler like this very approachable, very easy. And I swear we put it in, and we had instant buyer's remorse because it looked like a hospital all of a sudden. We're like, what are we doing? But then you soften it. You put a couch here and like a rug there and a chair, and it all like you trust like that it makes sense. But like when you first put it in, it's very almost like oppressive, but it's like endless expanse. But then. Yeah, you realize exactly that. It's the services that you engage with that make the house.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask about the definition of modernism, right? That we started with. You define it as change with tradition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Before tradition was ornament, was, you know, doing the same thing but ornament. And I guess modernism removed that, but that's kind of, it's also gone, right? Like I think we should now get those principles of less is more. Use the material, be honest with the material that we have available right now, right? So, and I think it's always hard, don't you think? Like the code is getting harder every day. It's a reactive way of approaching code. There's no really general approach to it. So we need to call an architect, as one of my professors in Spain would say. If it's complicated, that's the challenge, right? That's why we're here. So I think that this forum is good because we are kind of trying to think what is the goal as architects in LA. I agree with you, I'm positive. I think it's a good place for experimental and to try new things, but I don't know if, I don't know, like these boxes, like what Jose was saying about the developers, right? I think that that's the real problem that we have, and how can we not join them in the team of, you know, like build the lots to the maximum and this real estate game of price per square footage. It's like, how can we go beyond that as architects?
Yeah, I wish I had an answer.
Yeah.
You know, a thing that gave me slight, I even hate to say this, like a very modest house recently up near Elysian Park, and I hesitate to say this because it plays into like the capitalist, somewhat predatory real estate market, but this very modest house that was only like 1,100 square feet and had this beautiful garden went for wildly over asking, and it like set a new record. I don't think that's great necessarily, so I'm not like applauding that, but the only thing that gave me slight pause when I heard about that real estate transaction happening is that it showed that people, or that at least that particular buyer, prioritized something being beautiful over something having a large square footage.
That's the
And
goal.
so I actually think that these small subdivisions have the potential to destroy our city because they embody all the things that are not good about architecture and design, and that you live in these things that maximize the square footage and they prioritize the car. We turn down these projects mostly because they prioritize the vehicle, and so there's no opportunity to build a garden, and this is a longer conversation. But that one small thing gave me hope that like maybe a certain amount of the population will start to actually like prioritize the modest, beautiful thing over the thing that's 7,000 square feet and has all this room. But I think we're speaking to larger shifts in culture that need to take place, of which architecture plays a small part or a role. But yeah.
And I would also just say to take advantage of every opportunity. You know, like if you all of a sudden have a possibility to put your building back 2 feet and put a little garden towards the street, I mean,
It's like what Mies van der Rohe did on the
like
Fifth Avenue.
yeah, it was more than
Fifth Avenue.
2 feet. Yeah, I think so. I think we have to kind of understand, like or kind of believe that in the meaningfulness of every gesture. You know, if we reclaim one tile, it's only one tile at least, and I don't know, like taking, not understanding that we won't have a solution tomorrow, but that we just, if we make a little step forward, then that's a good step.
I was hanging out with these Mexican architects recently, and we were in Los Angeles, and they were talking about cities and things, and they made this observation that made me feel so positive. They were like, LA is such a young city. And I was like, oh, you're right. And like, if you think about like Rome or any like of the great cities like in Europe, that they've existed for so long, and it's been these iterative experiments. And I was like, oh, you're right. Maybe our city has so many problems because it is so young, and it's gonna take time. So to your point of like every generation or every house that's built like going a step in the right direction.
I think there is also something interesting to be said about the value of architecture that is intangible, or of landscape architecture. And I think this house is an example of that. I think the house that we saw, Jessica's house, is also an example of that. And if we learn how to talk about it, or we talk about it more with clients, maybe that is also something that is going to be part of the desire of designing. So it's not necessarily a feature that you can point to that is material and shows up in a picture, but it's like the ability, for instance, of circulating around this house, like, and you see the outdoors, or the view from the bedroom, from one side to the other, or from the little garden to the view. These are things that maybe are not as easy to discuss as features, you know, when you talk with a client, but they then make the value architecture, like they elevate the space to a space that is interesting and desirable and beautiful.
But we need to stop caring about resale value.
Right.
Honestly, and start thinking about like your own value,
Yeah.
your experiential value.
Yeah.
I hate the term resale value. Anytime a client says that to me, I'm like, oh no.
But it's also that most, you know, we also have this conversation with clients that they want like a beautiful architecture, but then also they want the resale value. So they're stuck in a strange place in which, I mean, not to say that the good architecture is necessarily expensive. It is in these markets, like we were saying before, but usually it's like two topics that they don't belong to the same conversation. Like you're gonna find somebody who's gonna want to buy this place, but let's not worry about it right now. You know, it doesn't have to be a quantitative value, but maybe they're gonna, you know, the resale value can be in the value of architecture, not necessarily in the size.
You're gonna live there for 5 years, so you know, make it what pleases you in a space that you want to be in, and not think about what happens 5 years.
Yeah.
Right, unless they come with the dream house, or the forever house, list and resale value. But yeah, I think this is, as the president was bitching about, the fun.
Totally.
So maybe we have one more question and then we close.
Yeah, there's something for David, actually. I'm just curious because as architects, like we always think about our projects kind of in a longer timeline, even though in LA a lot of things get churned up very, very quickly. But in general, people kind of always think this lasts like 50 years, 100 years, or however long. We think about durability, like I'm just curious, like how do you think about your projects? Like what is the timeline that's in their mind? Like do they come in a string like throughout your career, or do you look at them after a few years and what happens to them, or I don't know.
I can answer that. Because I find it so fascinating because he always kind of you always take more photographs of the garden you did at Jessica's place.
It looks totally different from the photos, but keep going.
It's very, I find it very funny. As architects, often we only shoot our houses once. You know, like, and then you said your photographer, what's her name again? Caitlin, you know, like, it's really interesting that to see how that's just kind of written. Because normally when a landscape designer finishes his project, he said, okay, and now in a year or two I send the photographer.
Yeah.
It's amazing, you know, for us as architects to think of. Sorry.
No, that's part of the answer. Part of the answer is we stay, and this is like endlessly kind of why I feel old, is that we stay a little bit involved in most of our projects forever if we can. And so there's an increasingly like a nebula of like us checking in on projects. And usually the way we do it is the first year we check in a few times and then increasingly less. But then maintenance is incredibly important to us. And we have gardeners. We believe that maintenance is incredibly important because, I mean, Brendan knows this, but when we're done with the project, it's just starting. So that's like a very like interesting thing like to navigate. But then also I would offer that landscapes, I mean I'd say houses are the same way, but landscapes have lifespans, right? So like this project, which was a Garrett Expo project, had simply, the concrete had heaved, the plants that they had planted, most of them were too big, and so we tried to think deeply long term about the trees we plant and why we're planting them in their proximity to houses, both at a 1 to 5 year time scale, but then a 30-year time scale, but while also acknowledging in 30 years this garden is going to need to be redone in some capacity. Whether it's me, it probably won't be me, or it's the next person, that all these things, houses have life cycles, we're in a house that's had a life cycle, and so just being honest about that, like trying to build a thing that's really damn well built and thoughtfully built for the long term, but also acknowledging that at some point in time this thing's gonna need refurbishment as well, and that's like maybe the part of the beauty of design, and I don't know, we exist in like this time ecosystem. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, totally. Like, I was just thinking as you were talking that time must be so much more of a part of your thinking about the project. I feel like in architecture usually it's like, oh, it got built and then it's all downhill from here or something.
It's true, you know, like the few time-based projects I put in there are like kind of very special because it's kind of very exceptional. You know? Normally you have a start and end very clearly defined.
But it's actually nice. I mean, I think even in architecture it's nice to think about the house as a person or a member of the family, and they get older, but it doesn't mean everything like to replace necessarily.
I think it's interesting to do a project and then see how it's occupied, how it's, you know, somebody takes over and just let it happen.
Yeah.
I mean, you work with your client or whatever, and then you create something, and then you let them take over. And maybe another family comes in a few years and takes over again. And I think that's part of the life cycle of what you do.
I'd like to ask Wonne about how you design with time in mind, because I remember a couple of months ago I went to see one of your projects in the Virlande Valley. It's like a public project, and I was so surprised that after years it's the same as, or at least for me, like it hasn't changed. I mean, it's changed a little bit, but almost nothing. And in Mexico, you get people interviewing so much the spaces.
Yeah, I mean that project is specially designed as well to kind of withstand time because it's a government-based project and they give funding once. You deliver the building and then there's no funding, not for nothing, not to maintain, not to operate the building, and so we had a whole fight. They put an elevator in there and I knew it would break down after a year and that nobody would ever repair it. It's still working to my surprise, but for the rest, all the rest of the building needs zero maintenance and like very thick 30 centimeter thick concrete walls, you know, that it's like so very high thermal mass, so it's all, I hope when you were there it was kind of okay, the building in temperature, because it has no air conditioning, it has nothing, there's like zero systems in there, only electricity and some plumbing for the restrooms. And so yeah, that was really designed with time in mind in that sense.
Alright, thank you very much, guys.